Welcome everyone to the panel discussion on the lecture Resilience and Innovation in Japan by Professor Jenny Corbett from Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo. My name is Marcin Jarzebski. I'm Project Assistant Professor at Tokyo College, and I'll be moderating this session as well as together with Dr. Mark Bookman, Postdoctoral Fellow at Tokyo College, and Professor MATSUI Akihiko from the School of Economics, the University of Tokyo. We are going to hold the discussion with Professor Corbett. I'll be the first one to give my comments, followed by a response from Professor Corbett. And after that, Dr. Bookman and Professor Matsui will deliver their comments and questions, which again will receive responses from our honorable speaker, Professor Corbett. So please kindly let me begin. So dear Professor Corbett, thank you very much for the very fascinating lecture on resilience and innovation of Japanese economy. I'm not economist, but the Japanese economy has been always intriguing and phenomenal for me. And as a sustainability scientist, I did often use the concept of resilience to understand some of studied phenomena. And I'm aware that resilience understanding, despite having the same origin, vastly differs between disciplines. In your presentation, there was a very clear message that the Japanese economy indicates to be quite resilient with many rather shorter cycles of decline, followed by quick recoveries. And also spending and savings rates of Japanese people have remained fairly stable. In general, Japan has experienced this rapid development, and then it has reached a sort of maturity state, but no drastic decline can be seen, especially if you're a foreign resident here. And the question which arises whether these economic cycles that you have talked about and changes in a long perspective are showing any signs of adaptation, and do you see any longer cycles being repeated in the post-war economy? So what I'm really interested in, if we can foresee what is the next phase of Japanese economy. Further on, as a sustainability concerned researchers, I was also wondering if current economy could be actually transformed by promoting the development of innovative technologies and the use of renewable energy and bring the country to the zero emission by 2050. First of all, the progress is fairly slow. I believe there is an urgent need to mitigate climate change, but the cost burden making the Japanese production carbon neutral will unquestionably make the profitability of the companies much smaller. So many of Japanese production facilities has set up outside the country already due to rising other environmental costs. However, there is interest from companies in taking the part in energy transition towards the zero emission. But it feels still like it is held back by the global cost competition. Therefore, I was wondering if in case of Japan, is it being one of So I was wondering if in case of Japan, is being one of the pioneering countries in energy transition advantage or maybe disadvantage in a short or long term? Furthermore, in my recent work, I have become questioning sustainability of aging and shrinking society, and you have touched upon some of related issues during the lecture. And I would like to ask further about possible changes in investment rates. With aging society, there will be less investment as older people tend to take a less risk, saving more and rather use the savings for life retirement. And do you think this would put additional limitation to the Japanese economy and cause even more steep decline? Another issue I would like to ask about the pension system, which is becoming quite fragile. In 2050, actually, there will be over one working person per one retired citizen, and we need to add children to the dependent group. And one of adaptive strategies that I have noticed Japan is taking these days is is that with reduced labor force, Japan tends to increase overseas investments for future profits, and whereas other Asian countries with shrinking economy reduce their overseas investments, and Japan is actually doing the opposite way. So do you think this will make the economy and pension system more stable or sustainable in the future, or rather instead of it increasing migration, which is not very prioritized now, would boost the Japanese economy and pension system? So this is all from me, Professor Corbett.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much indeed. Let me respond to those questions, and some of the things that I'd like to say I think will come up as we hear from the other discussants too. So some of them I will hold off until later. But on the first point about resilience, and part of this question, I think, is about what does resilience really mean in economics? And I think that Matsui Sensei is going to say some things about that. So I'll probably come back and talk a bit more about definitions at that point. But I think that the other part of your point there is that I was talking very much about short-term cycles. I was just talking about response to, changes in growth rates over a period of, say, a couple of years. And you're asking quite rightly about longer-term cycles. So what I would say about that is that there is quite a lot of work in economics about long cycles. It's been an interesting topic in economics really since the 1920s, or even a little before that. But it's still quite, not controversial exactly, but it's not, there is no widely accepted view about long cycles in economic history and economic performance. So the idea of a long cycle, that is a pattern that you can observe in a range of economic variables over, say, 40 to 60 years, has been associated with a number of well-known economists. They're usually referred to as Kondratiev cycles. And that name was given to them by Schumpeter, who was an extremely well-known economist who's written a lot about innovation. But he named them after the Russian economist who was really the first well-known proponent of the idea that you can observe these kind of long cycles in economic data. And the interesting thing about Kondratiev is partly that his work was actually well-known and admired by a well-known Japanese economist, Akamatsu, who has become associated with a couple of different cyclical patterns that he had written about in the Japanese case. So there's the famous Akamatsu model is the flying geese model, which describes the way in which economies, first of all, absorb new ideas or new products from abroad, then they produce them at home, and then they gradually are able to export. The way we think about the flying geese model today is usually in terms of particular industries where you can observe that kind of pattern of import, domestic production and export. But it got picked up as a sort of metaphor for a whole pattern of development, actually, and applied to other Asian economies. People even tried to apply it as if there was a pattern with Japan as the leading goose and other Asian economies following. So none of those applicate or uses of the model were really in the original Akamatsu work, but nonetheless, there certainly is that tradition, both generally in economics and in Japanese economic history, to try and identify these long patterns. I think what's the controversy about them in economics is that, first of all, there are many people who say, actually, the data is just not good enough to support this. We can't really see this in the data. The second thing is there's no agreed story about what drives these. What are these cycles responding to? Kondratiev himself argued that, thought that these were driven by sort of social changes. He was a Marxist, and he believed that they were really driven by things like inequality and differences in social opportunity, things that, you know, lead to social revolution. But he was arguing that they also lead to technological change and to economic change, and that you sort of saw patterns emerging from that kind of changes in social structure and changes in innovation structure. And they could sometimes be triggered by major external events like war. Economists subsequently have identified other drivers that might explain these cycles. So Schumpeter himself was very much focused on the changes in technology story, that, you know, there were waves of new technologies being introduced. Those caused disruption, change to business models. Old companies disappeared, new companies grew up, and there were sort of cycles of creative destruction, which are very important in driving forward new technology. There have been other writers who've talked about demographic shifts in economies that drive these cycles. There have been discussions about debt and credit cycles. And recently there's been work on IT-driven and health-driven cycles too. So there is quite a lot of work there. I think, you know, I'm not an expert in this, and I don't know how many of those different stories have been developed for Japan, but I do think that in your field of climate environment, that we may well look back on the second half of the 20th century and see some sort of cyclical pattern driven by responses to climate disasters that lead to policy and innovation and, you know, technological changes that have impacts on economies. So, you know, I think it is, and it is in some ways, I think it's an even more important part of the resilience story. I didn't talk at all about Japan's economic resilience in the face of disasters, which is clearly something that people seeing resilience in the title of the talk might have expected. And there's a lot you could say about that. So I think it's an important point to raise. Let me then turn to your point about Japan's, whether Japan might become a leading technological developer in the zero emissions game, or where Japan will be positioned in trying to achieve the target of zero emissions by 2050. And as you say, there's slow progress so far, and it is expensive to do this. So the question is, does the expense mean that companies won't try, or is Japan potentially a leader here? And I think that Japan has great potential in some parts of this story, not in all. And I think there is huge effort going on in companies at the moment. I mean, every time you speak to a company, it's the first thing they talk about. So there's no doubt that there's a lot of research and development effort going into this. And I think that the expense side of it is not putting companies off. I think they see that the potential gains from being first in the market with technologies that work is very, very great. And so I think that, you know, many Japanese companies really want to be highly competitive in this field. I think for example, hydrogen technologies, you know, there's great talk about the hydrogen economy in the relationship between Australia and Japan, which I've spent some time thinking about. You know, this is one of the fields where we think there's huge potential for bilateral developments. But the reality is that Japan has been fairly slow compared to some other Asian countries in implementation or in building the infrastructure that will make it possible to implement the developments that are already technically possible. And I'm told that Korea and China are quite a way ahead of Japan in that. So I think that, there is great potential for Japan, and that there's no question that being a leader is the position to be in. Actually, being a follower in this field is much less lucrative than being a leader, despite the big development costs. So I think Japan definitely wants to be in the vanguard, so we can but hope that that will happen. Then I'd like to turn to this question about aging societies, which is a very interesting one because it relates to the idea of risk that I raised in the lecture, and the idea of risk preferences and whether people are risk averse or not. And your question is, how does the aging demographic impact on this? And I think, while I think you are right that probably older people are even more risk averse than younger people, I don't think that that automatically means that you have a society that cannot, where investment is reduced, where there are fewer chances and impetus to invest. And I think that the way to understand the link here is to think about the role of the financial system in an economy. So Japan is in a situation where there are ample savings in Japan to do the investment that is needed and to make innovations. Japan is not short of savings. Even when the elderly use up their savings to support their lifestyles through, once they're no longer working, there is still lots of saving in Japan. So there's no shortage of funding. So even with the elderly needing to support themselves, that doesn't mean that there's a problem. The only problem might come if you don't have a financial system that works the way you want a financial system to work. So what you really want the financial system to do is to be able to safely take in the savings of those who have surplus and pool those savings in a way that enables the savers to share risks. So they don't personally have to have a diversified portfolio of all kinds of different sophisticated investments that are going to move up and down and offset risks in each other. They just have to have financial institutions that will do that on their behalf. And as long as that financial system is there, then the savers can still have low risk savings products, while the financial markets can provide risk finance to a range of investors, because the financial institutions themselves will pool the risks in ways that offset. And as long as that's working, then, the aging society problem doesn't impact directly there. It clearly impacts on labor force and potentially on productivity, although I think as we go forward, we will find ways for elderly people who want to work to continue to work in productive ways. And it may impact on the consumption patterns in the economy. What kinds of things people will consume will change as the demographic ages. But I don't think it directly impacts on investment. But it's a big, complicated argument, and I know some of my colleagues don't agree with me on this. So let me then turn to the final point that you made, and I'll keep this short because we did talk a little bit about it in response to a question in the lecture, which is about the impact of aging societies on the burden on the young and on the pension system, and therefore on public finances and so on. And those are real problems. That is a big issue. I did talk in the lecture in response to a question a little bit about the potential for robots and technology to solve the labor problem. But I think that the need to find lots of profitable forms of investment is critical for Japan's success. So you've pointed to the possibility for overseas investment, and I think that profitable overseas investment is is certainly part of the solution for Japan, because the profits are then repatriated back to Japan. That gives companies enough to pay taxes, to pay pensions, to pay salaries, and so on. So that's definitely part of the the solution. But as you also noted, immigration is going to be an important part. Now, I want to stop there and let Mark Bookman and MATSUI Sensei make their remarks so I can respond to those. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny, for very insightful responses. Thank you.
Professor Corbett, thank you so much for an informative presentation and for the comments you've made so far. So I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but issues of economics and resilience, innovation, all permeate my work as a historian of disability policy and connected social movements in Japanese and transnational contexts. So your lecture and your comments have given me a lot to think about. But there are a couple anecdotes and questions that kind of immediately came to mind that I was hoping to talk with you about them. And the first is towards the end of your lecture, you made a point about how profit maximization is sometimes less desirable than interest in community outcomes. And that really resonated with me. You know, I recall an attempt by the Japanese government to create a zero payment system for old people's medical expenses back in the 1970s. This system was developed to aid the nation's rapidly aging population, which became increasingly visible during the so-called economic miracle post-war Reconstruction era. So in the short term, the zero payment medical system proved to be a net loss for the Japanese government as hospitals and care facilities started to engage in profiteering behavior and carry out unnecessary surgeries or procedures that they could get money from the government for. But in the long term, the zero payment medical system actually helped improve longevity and spark conversations in different sectors of society about how to improve the quality of life for Japan's graying population. And it led to the production of new consumer markets. So paired with protests from other groups of disability activists in the late 1970s, Japan experienced what I've called a barrier-free boom, if you will, which was characterized by technological innovations in architecture, transportation, and built environments, as well as the creation of new assistive devices. These sorts of very profit-minded capitalistic innovations then in turn facilitated a new welfare paradigm, shifting focus back to the community outcomes. And this case study really got me thinking for a moment. Are stability and innovation sequential or perhaps cyclic? In other words, could focus on community outcomes in Japan today bring about a better profit margin tomorrow? And a second case study that connects to this but is somewhat different involves Japan's recent attempts to deal with an ongoing caregiving crisis. So it's no secret that roughly 30% of Japan's population is over the age of 65. And there are also many disabled people who need caregiving support for things like dressing, bathing, eating, sleeping, similar tasks. Current estimates put Japan around 340,000 caregivers short. That's a supply versus demand ratio of roughly 1 to 13. So to resolve this issue, the Japanese government has considered a number of solutions. For instance, they've looked at importing migrant labor from South Asia or investing in the development of caregiving robots. As migrant labor requires significant financial investment with relatively little return, and what I mean by that is it requires language and cultural competency training, relocation support, assistance with other challenges, opening a bank account, for instance. The Japanese government has seen that and begun to funnel resources more towards the development of caregiving robots. After all, caregiving robots, unlike their human counterparts, can easily be exported to different parts of the world. And despite their initial higher investment fee, you can expect some type of remuneration as they're bought up for consumers in Germany, the United States, other places. Having said that, Japan's caregiving robots have already sparked some fear in the nation's old and disabled communities amongst people who worry that they will not be as responsive or useful as humans in providing care. And these fears are really magnified for members of old and disabled communities elsewhere who have the added difficulty of not only dealing with a technical device that may not be as useful for them, but one that is constrained by Japanese standards, perhaps by language issues, and may not be able to conform as efficiently to local needs. So this case study gets at a second question that I was really hoping to ask you, and that's how might Japan's local inclinations about stability and resilience, its local responses, influence global markets, the production of technologies elsewhere, and this sort of balance between profit maximization and community outcomes in other parts of the world as well. So hopefully after we hear some comments from Matsui Sensei, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this so that we can have a conversation. So
Sure.
thank you.
Okay, can I share the screen? Okay. All right.
Allow me to speak in Japanese today. So, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this distinguished panel. I am very honored to be part of this panel today. Now, my research area focuses on diversity as well. Therefore, I would like to make a comments and raise questions from the viewpoint of diversity. Firstly, I am an economist, and I am not going to read this out, everything, but in economics, there are many ways of thinking. For one, and the science of people should be established. So Adam Smith has that basic principle since the days of Adam Smith that has been said. So in this process, there is a many very famous passage, as you can see in the bottom of that page. In the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. So this is what Adam Smith said. So we have to focus on humans and the relationship between people. This is the very basics of the society. So from that perspective, I have been conducting my research. From that point of view, the key words for today's session is resilience, resilient society or resilience. I think this is the key word. So let me stop and think about this phrase. So if the society is based on human beings, society is resilience only when people are resilient. So people are resilient in order for society to be resilient. That is my basic view. Now, in a sense, resilient society can accommodate not only the majority, but also the minority. So this is an inclusive society that can include the minority people as well. So in this sense, unfortunately, Japan is not necessarily a very resilient country, far from it, in my view. For instance, please look at this chart. Horizontally, there is a total social expenditures as percentage of GDP, and vertically, it's incapacity-related public spending. So OECD average, compared to OECD average, social security related public spending is a bit lower than the average of OECD. However, when it comes to disability-related, incapacity-related spending, OECD average is 2.3%, but Japan's percentage is only 0.7%. That means that Japan is very low when it comes to incapacity-related public spending. So Japan is not the comfortable society for the disabled, and the efforts has not been made in order to make the society more friendly to the disabled. However, I don't want to single out Japan as an inferior country, but I want to show you Japan is moving forward. I want to do justice to Japan. This is the employment ratio of the disabled compared to the general employment. You can see the ratio, particularly it is growing to the upper right, employed PWE, PWD meaning people with disability. So employed PWD line has been increasing upright quite rapidly. This is a very good sign, I think. Now, when you consider such an issue, of course, we have to have a macroeconomic perspective. However, a microeconomic perspective is very important. We have to focus on individuals also. So from that point of view, let me think about the following. So the society that can accommodate minority as well, which is a resilient society. Again, this is the key word. Well-being is another key word. Resilient society increases the well-being of not only the minority, but also the majority as well. I say this because people find it difficult to live in any kind of society. People want to make efforts to adapt themselves to the society. For instance, a group of disabled people, workplace women, and other people in other situations would suffer more than others. They have to make extra efforts in many cases. So in order to accommodate such people in need, in difficulty, although everybody find it difficult to survive and live, however, accommodating the minority implies accommodating all, because after all, everybody find it difficult to live in any society. For example, elevator at a metro station has been established thanks to the disabled-related mobility movement. However, because of the installment of such elevator for the disabled, very tired workers, and also the pregnant women and mother with baby strollers also can use them. So accommodating minority means accommodating all. At the University of Tokyo, there has been a remote work system introduced. In 2010, the system was introduced, remote work system that is, at that time. Let me skip this. No, I want to stay on this page. In 2010, when the system was introduced, still, those who have a severe physical disability was the target of this new system. That system should not be applied to any other groups. That was the thinking of the University of Tokyo office. However, gradually, the horizon has been expanded, thankfully, and particularly during the COVID-19, this system became very handy and contributed a lot. For those who want to use this remote work system, they are able to use this system. So this new provision has been added to the system. Sorry, this is in Japanese. At the time of introduction of this system, there was only one line which says faculty members with the severe physical impairment can use this system. However, today, those who are parenting now can use this system. Those who are taking care of their family members, and also those who have difficulty commuting due to disability or pregnancy, or those who have difficulty commuting due to earthquake and other natural disasters, and also those who can expect to improve work productivity and efficiency by working from home. So in a nutshell, the coverage of this system has expanded significantly, although the system was introduced initially only for the disabled. However, this system was expanded to cover everybody so that the system can contribute to the well-being of everybody. Such a perspective should be introduced to the economics, in my view. So on this point, I would like to receive response from Professor Corbett. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those both sets of comments, which are extremely interesting and thought-provoking. I'll start by addressing the specific questions that Mark Bookman has raised, and then come to the points that Matsui Sensei has raised, which really do go to the heart of something that I didn't talk about in the lecture, but we clearly do need to talk about. So in response to Mark's question, the first question really was whether we can see some kind of either linear pattern, sequential pattern, or a cyclical pattern in the relationship between stability and innovation. And you gave some very nice examples of policies that were introduced for one purpose, had some unintended consequences, which resulted in particular kinds of behavior, and then had to call forth an additional response to that set of circumstances, so that you can see a kind of action and reaction happening that links stability and innovation, or links policy response and reaction in an interesting way. And I would say that there are several pieces of that I'd like to unpack. The first was your question really about my point about whether the focus on community can bring profit opportunities as part of it. So I made that point in the lecture, and you've illustrated it nicely, that what can start as an action that is not apparently about making profit can actually create profit opportunities, for good or bad. Sometimes they're profiteering opportunities, and sometimes they are just profit opportunities. And that's exactly the argument of the book that I referred to in the lecture by Colin Mayer. The book is called Prosperity, and it's one of a couple that he's written about the nature of the company in contemporary economies. How do companies operate, and how do we think they should operate? And the point that he makes is that companies that have a purpose that is broader than just making profits have in fact been, on the whole, very successful, and in many cases more successful than companies that do not have a stated purpose. So, some companies, you can look on their websites or in their annual reports, and they actually describe the company as having a purpose or a mission, or, a value system, something that they are trying to achieve, which isn't just making a lot of money for their shareholders. And Mayer's argument is that having that kind of purpose, defined purpose, actually gives companies more strategic focus, so that if they're trying to think about how to change the company, what to do next, what new opportunity to pursue, they have a way of deciding whether that action is going to be in line with their purpose. So they have a benchmark against which to decide whether to do something that isn't just, is this project going to break even and make us some money, but actually, is this project part of the portfolio of things that we as a company think we should be doing? So his argument is that actually companies with purpose have in many cases, found more profitable opportunities than those without. And so there's not necessarily a juxtaposition, an opposition of those two things. So that is the first part of your question, I think. Then the second part is about the fact that policy actions often have unintended consequences, and those can create some curious circumstances in which you get private or organizations. They don't have to be private firms. It may be, as in your case, your example of hospitals. Somebody steps in to try and take advantage of an opportunity that's been created by a policy. Or it may be that the policy has put in place barriers to doing things, and then the organizations come in with creative ways to get round the barrier. But what's interesting is that in all those cases, you often get an innovation that comes out of it because somebody invents a new way of doing something in order either to take advantage of or avoid the effects of the policy. So, what was originally just a policy that was intended for social purposes has then created this economic activity that follows from it. And I think, we can certainly find examples that lead to good outcomes and examples that lead to bad outcomes. I'm not sure how one can generalize that, but I think your final point, which is an interesting idea, is whether this can lead to cycles of actions that appear to be mainly non-profit oriented, mainly about a social outcome, that then create a cycle of profit-making activity or sort of more conventional economic activity, which then generates another cycle of a response that is more about the social outcome, possibly because the profit-making outcome has generated something that you have to react to, or because it's opened up a new opportunity that policy can then take advantage of and make advances on the social side. So I think, it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure that anybody has untangled that. And as I was saying at the beginning in response to Marcin about work on long-term cycles, I think this is perhaps another interesting way of thinking about whether, we can observe some of that wave movement in these fields. And I think, you wouldn't expect those kind of cycles to be 40 or 60 year length. They would presumably be somewhat more like the life cycle of a product, which is, I think, 10 to 15 years. You might see something happening there. And sometimes these things will need a crisis to start them off. And sometimes it's just going to be an opportunity that arises. And I think, the examples that come out of your own work about the way disabled activist groups have created opportunities. And Matsui Sensei also mentioned, the fact that we now all can use the elevators in the subways. Those are the sort of examples that come not out of a crisis, but out of some ongoing problem that, eventually an innovation takes place. Let me turn then quickly to your second question about what might be the global implications of Japan's particular mix of desire for stability and resilience, but also innovation, and what will that mean for the rest of the world? And you've given some examples of innovations that Japan has developed in response to something happening domestically, which then are exported but may not fit the environment into which they are being introduced. And I think that part of your point there is that policy, but I would add product innovation to business innovation, needs to be stakeholder driven. If you just try and do something top down, you're very likely to end up with a system or a product that isn't actually going to suit the purpose or the needs of the people who are actually going to use it, unless you've consulted with them properly. And I would say in response that really whether Japan is going to be really successful at that in the sort of new fields we're talking about comes back to the way in which Japanese companies go about innovation. And I think there are some things that would make one hope that they could actually be very good at this. So, you know, Japanese companies have a history of innovating when what you want is very slow change. You know, you don't want to be the disruptor of an entire industry. What you want to do is sort of gradually improve things. And that's, you know, that kind of incremental innovation is exactly what Japanese companies have been good at for a very long time. It's the sort of innovation that we think of as being a Japanese strength. And it's Japanese companies have used it for product and process innovation. And it's kind of consistent with an idea that you want to preserve while developing something new. So you don't want to, you know, throw everything away and start altogether new. Now, the problem with that is that it's very frustrating if the problem that needs to be solved is something that's been going on for a very long time. And certainly in the fields that you work in, as you've shown, you can have decades in which nothing happens. Then eventually you get a boom. So as you described, the sort of mobility boom and other things suddenly begin to move, but it's taken an inordinate amount of time to get to the takeoff point. And that is certainly something that frustrates all observers of Japan. On the other hand, you know, there are some pretty important global innovations that have come out of this Japanese way of doing things. So, for example, Japanese firms have been enormously influential in developing the whole basis for supply chain driven global production systems, you know, thing where we now think it's perfectly normal to unpack a whole production process and do stages of it in various different places where the particular activity is well suited to a particular locality. In order to make that happen, you have to have very complicated systems of supply chain linkages. And it's been Japanese firms who have developed an awful lot of the logistics and all of the ways in which that happens. It's almost invisible to the ordinary consumer of things. You really don't even think about this. It's all just out there. What it has meant is that Japanese firms have been very involved in adapting to local circumstances. So they, you know, invest overseas and set up a part of a supply chain that takes advantage of whatever it is that the local, that locality does well. Now, that was not the way Japanese overseas investment used to operate. In the 1970s, Japanese overseas investors were always criticized for simply taking a Japanese model, taking Japanese staff, building a factory and trying to do everything as if it was Japan, and was very unpopular with local communities. They were, you know, had a serious relationship problem in Southeast Asia, but things have changed dramatically. You know, Japanese investment is widely welcomed all around the Asian region, precisely because they're now very good at that kind of local adaptation. So they have learned to listen to local stakeholders in that particular example. In the fields that you're working in, it's clear there are examples where they and policymakers have not been listening to local stakeholders. All we can hope is that this is going to come, and that it comes sooner than it did in other examples, that this learning process is getting quicker. But I would be, you know, cautiously optimistic that whatever it is, Japanese built wheelchairs or, you know, robots for particular purposes will be not only available, but locally adapted. On the other hand, we may see that it goes the way of the mobile telephone, where, Japan never developed mobile telephone technology that went anywhere else because they simply wouldn't hear what it was that users wanted. And I don't have the crystal ball, so I don't know. But thank you for those points, because I think it's very interesting. Now, MATSUI Sensei, there are a lot of things here that you've said that I should not dodge. I mean, these are hard questions about the places that Japan has so far neglected, the things that the parts of the Japanese community that are not well served by the current, have not been well served by the current Japanese model. So I certainly don't want to be saying that that the fact that this is a stable economy where average standards of living are very high means in any sense that that everything is fine. It's clearly, this is a set of issues and we know that there are other communities equally not being served, and we worry about the fact that there may be new communities emerging who are also falling through the gaps. So if it may be the case that people who are in part-time employment, who are not in the mainstream of Japanese society, may be at risk. And that's certainly something, and as you've said, we should be careful about how we define resilience. And I use the term, I proposed the title in English, and then we had to have a discussion about how to translate it into Japanese. And I think it's quite hard to choose a Japanese word that that captures sort of everything that's packaged up in the English word resilience, although perhaps that's just laziness on our part. In English, we don't think about it very hard. I used it in a very narrow sense. I used it in the sense of being able to recover, an economy that is able to recover from short-term cyclical behavior in economic aggregates. And even in the economics literature, there are broader definitions. So I looked up definitions that the OECD uses and the one that World Bank has used, and they are wider than the one that I used, but none of them get to the point that you're making. So the OECD definition is economic resilience is defined as the capacity of an economy to reduce vulnerabilities, to resist shocks, and to recover quickly. So that's already wider than I was using, because I wasn't talking about reducing vulnerabilities, and I was talking really about resisting shocks and recovering quickly. But there's a World Bank paper that goes much further and talks about macroeconomic resilience and microeconomic resilience, which gets a bit closer to your sense. So macro resilience is around responding to disasters. Now, they can be just economic disasters, or they can be physical disasters, but responding at the macro aggregate level. And that has two components. That's the instantaneous resilience. That's the ability to limit the immediate production losses and from disasters. And dynamic resilience, which is about the recovery pattern. But then the micro resilience is about the welfare impact on particular groups. So it's about the distribution of losses and whether household vulnerabilities can be dealt with. So whether if households lose income, can they get back to smoothing those shocks and being able to use savings and borrowings and restore their consumption and so on. And it depends on the social protection system. So I think, you're absolutely right to say that really we should use this term with caution, and we should include the notion of who is able to recover in what ways from what kind of shocks. And that's something that, and what I would, I suppose, respond and ask in return is really, what kind of measures can we use to capture that sense of resilience? If we wanted to say is this a resilient economy? You really need, I think, a range of different indicators. And I don't know if perhaps you have some ideas about what we should be including in that. And is stability of consumption as critical as I was implying in the lecture? Is that what we need to look at? If we do, we obviously need to look at it for different groups. I mean, because the averages are not going to tell us the things that you have pointed out. So could we use that, the ability to restore consumption and living standards across different groups? But that, I guess, isn't going to be enough. I mean, for people with disabilities, consumption numbers may be meaningless if you don't have mobility, you don't have access, you don't have the care, support, all those things. So how should we capture those things would be my question. And finally, if we have time, you've written in your own work about norms and values in economics. And I would really like to hear you talk a little bit about the way economics has changed to begin to think more deeply about norms and values rather than the notion of a kind of representative rational agent. Those days are past, but what's coming? And we don't have much time, but if you have a minute to respond, that would be great.
Yeah, it's perhaps difficult to respond to it in a minute, but game theory actually talks about the science of man, focusing on the interaction of human being. And there is a sort of unwritten, established behavior pattern. And that shall be called, social conventions or social norms, depending on the situations. And by doing that, we can talk about, the issues minority faces and so on. So that's the kind of issues that I'm interested in.
Very, very interesting. Well, part of what I wanted to say in the lecture was that I think that economics should, and in optimistic moments, I think it is changing. That, we're, as a discipline, becoming broader minded and also importantly, developing methodologies that really allow us to think deeply about these things. I mean, it's one thing for us individually to care about these things, but to be able to analyze them with rigor is a genuine challenge. But at least now there is an effort being made. What we also need, though, are great case studies of the kind that you both, Mark Bookman and MATSUI Sensei, have found. But I guess we also need data. We were talking just before we came on air about the fact that actually the data collection around many of the issues for people with disabilities is not systematic, and therefore we can't do evidence-based policy because we don't have data. That's something that,
but data is collected only when people get interested in it.
Yes.
So unless people get interested in disability issues or homeless issues, we can't have data. So that's like a chicken and egg problem. So sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's great. And hopefully this kind of discussion helps to raise interest. But I think, these are very important points that are ways in which, again, as academics, we can help have some impact on what policymakers do by raising those kind of questions. So I should stop there and let Marcin wrap up for us.
Thank you very much, Professor Jenny Corbett, for very insightful responses. And I'm afraid this is we are heading towards the end of this session. I would like to also thank Dr. Bookman and Professor Matsui for wonderful commentary. And also, I would like to thank everyone for watching this session and for your interest in this session and in seminars run by Tokyo College. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for this, for your time and for your inputs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.